Welcome back. We're examining the situation of Iraqi women since the 2003 US-led invasion. In a country where women were lawyers, engineers and doctors under Saddam Hussein, they're now afraid to leave their homes because of the increasing level of violence. With me is Christina Asquith, author of Sisters in War, a story of love, family and survival in the new Iraq. She covered the war there in 2003 and 2004. And from Baghdad, we have Manal Omar, who works for the US Institute of Peace. After opposing the war in Iraq, she went there to support the country's women. Manal, a question for you on that came in from Facebook, from the United Arab Emirates, from Jamil Brownson, if I could put this to you. It says, "This is one of too many disastrous unintended consequences of the US invasion, which triggered a fundamentalist reaction throughout the region. A Pandora's box has opened, releasing a fierce patriarchal violence against women." It makes me wonder, when you look at what has caused so many men to turn and behave this way towards women, and really the situation has become quite terrible, what do you think was lurking under the surface? What do you think has prompted everything to be expressed so violently now?
I think that there's a lot of triggers for the type of violence that we're seeing, and I think that there's also a lot of expectations that weren't met. I mean, one of the biggest things that we saw early on in 2003 wasn't necessarily just the fact that there was the invasion, but there was a whole bunch of expectations from the Iraqis, part of which was already touched on in terms of revenge, but I would phrase more in terms of the quest for justice. People were expecting to see a change and a difference, and a lot of the core issues that had initially begun in 2003 never materialized, most of which I would say centered around women's rights. The door was open, promises were made, a lot of women, very courageous Iraqi women, and we're hearing about their difficulties, but I can't emphasize enough how strong, how competent, and how courageous the Iraqi women are, and a lot of them stood up in 2003 to demand their rights. As security began to deteriorate in 2004, women became more and more marginalized, and there was a reaction towards the presence of foreign forces. And we see in these situations the most vulnerable, the easiest population group to target is usually women. So in the beginning, it started off as what people call soft targets, being that the women were targeted. And then as time proceeded, a lot of the changes in the rights that women had initially had began to be challenged. And because the security was so bad, women were not able to continue to fight for their rights. And at the end, they had no one to champion their cause.
Well, Christina, there was another viewer question here. We had quite a few questions from our viewers on this, and this came in from a viewer by the name of Anju Giri, who wrote in saying, "Women cannot be the brunt of every conflict on earth. What international measures or internal dictates can be taken to safeguard their interests? It's time that men showed what stuff they're made of, other than their role as brutes." And it makes me wonder, from what you saw in Iraq, were there any men actually involved visibly or actively in the effort to try to secure the lives of women? Was it, I mean, obviously it's incumbent upon men to take part in this too?
Absolutely, and I would say to Andrew that not only are there men both on the street and in the parliament that were active on behalf of women's rights, but there were a lot of women that were active in the opposite effect in terms of trying to oppress women's rights, or at least what we conceive in the West and I understand to be feminism. You had the 25% quota in Parliament was filled in the January '05 elections with very conservative women, veiled from head to toe, many of them refusing to shake men's hands, many of them very emphatic about imposing Islamic law in a way that I would think would be very contrary to women's rights. So I don't think that this fight fell down gender lines at all.
Well, Christine, I'm going to read another quote from your book, Sisters in War. Here you talk about the role of the US in terms of doing something in Iraq. And here you say, "The Americans had little interest in women's issues beyond media stunts. When the CPA planned a women's conference, it was by invitation only. Few Iraqi women attended or ever heard about it. The cheery conference ended. The Washington, D.C. Women flew home. The media moved on." And that led me to a question that we had from Maryland here in the United States, where Michael David wrote in saying, "Recognizing things as they are, what can the American occupation forces in Iraq do to contribute to the betterment of women in Iraq?"
Well, I question how seriously Americans in Washington, D.C. took women's rights in Iraq. After the lead up to the war, in which the Bush administration made very exaggerated claims about how they would empower Iraqi women, we saw really very little in actual action on the ground. There were a lot of, as Manal calls them, Kodak moments, where they would build a fancy women's center and show up for the cutting of the ribbon, but then there would be very little in terms of follow-up or planning for follow-up. Americans were between a rock and a hard place in many cases because the Shia that came to power did not want to see the U.S. getting involved in women's issues. And anytime the U.S. did anything, Muqtada al-Sadr, the other conservative insurgency, would jump on the U.S. for meddling. And those are, you know, it's a hot button issue. It's a hot potato. And the U.S. could often set the cause back even further by appearing to be too heavy-handed on behalf of women, or doing anything that might be perceived as, say, exporting Americans' version of feminism with the sexual freedoms, with reproductive rights, with Baywatch, onto a Muslim country. So the U.S. was walking a very fine line. However, there's a lot that they can do right now. For one, I would like to see more moderate female candidates for Iraqi parliament receive support in terms of funding and training. And I'd like to see a lot more funding going to Iraqi women's groups on the ground, grassroots groups that are Iraqi-led. And that are working really out of threadbare offices with almost no funding.
Right. Manal, in fact, I think you and Heather Coyne, the U.S. soldier, the lieutenant, both co-founded a center for women as well in Baghdad. Tell me about that.
Yeah, I mean, we did work to form centers throughout Baghdad and to support women local initiatives. And one of the things that we realized, one of the things that we continue to emphasize, is that it's not just a matter of funding in terms of more buildings or more computers or more laptops or, you know, the actual physical funding. It's the capacity building and the leadership training and the softer side of development that needs to be emphasized when it comes to these women. A lot of the women activists have the raw skills, but they can't compete with the male politicians who are, you know, been trained all their lives in terms of being political, in terms of the negotiations. The other challenge that we found is that, you know, women and the women's issue in itself is often used as a negotiating chip. So a lot of times things that different political parties might agree on that are pro-women will be negotiated away with more conservative groups for more stronger issues like federalism or the, you know, oil law, election law. People will then begin to compromise when it comes to women's rights and women's issues, even if they agree with the content. And we found that in many cases, international community does the same. It's not only limited to Iraqi politicians.
In fact, Manal, I think you were skeptical when you arrived from the US and worried about the sort of US and Western efforts in trying to empower women and help their rights. In fact, some of your worst fears were realized when you had the women there saying to you, well, look, the best thing you could do for us is to put our husbands to work and stop killing our men. How do you move forward from that? How do you actually get their support and their trust?
Well, I mean, the biggest thing, I mean, the strongest thing is to engage the men initially when you're working within the women's community. But again, if the basic infrastructural needs are not met, it's very hard to talk about any rights within the country. When we interview with women with the basic needs, again, it's electricity, it's water, it's security. The more in depth we get, we begin to realize that some of the most basic legal rights that had been existed in the past is beginning to erode. But women will keep coming back to electricity, to employment for the men in their households. Of course, now, more currently in the last few years, we're seeing a huge amount of single-headed households, those being widows, those being divorcees as a result of the rise in the sectarian, and there being a lot of women who are responsible for you know, a significant amount of children, 5 or 6 children, and sometimes elderly parents. So women, and you know, the thing that's rising in Iraq is single-headed households. A lot of times in 2003, where they had the opportunity to say that we wanted our husbands to work or we want the male members, in most cases now they're being forced out to become the breadwinners. Right.
Well, Christine, I know that you had a very rare insight into the lives of women in Iraq, actually being, you know, sheltered by Zia and Nunu and seeing it firsthand rather than being embedded or being in the sort of general pool of reporters. So I wonder, I know you're keen and you're active to try to make things better there in Iraq. What's your suggestion to people when they say to you, what can we do to help? How would you suggest people get involved and do something positive for Iraq's women?
One of the reasons why I highlighted Manal's story in the book was because she, for me, is an example of what the U.S. needs to do more on behalf of Muslim issues and on behalf of Iraqi women and Muslim women. I mean, Manal, for one, she's Muslim. She speaks the language. She's veiled. And she's worked in the region for over a decade. This is really rare was rare in the Bush administration. It's rare in the State Department to find women with these qualifications, even though they're in these countries doing these issues. So the U.S., and yet there's an abundance of Arabic speakers in the U.S., abundant of Muslim women who are trained in these issues. And the State Department's really just not doing enough job finding them, recruiting them, getting them on the ground, and listening to what they say.
Okay.
So You know, I have a friend who works in the Pentagon. She tells me that it's when she speaks Arabic in the Pentagon, everybody turns around and stares at her suspiciously. I mean, we need to do more if we're going to be involved in these ways in these Muslim countries.
Right.
To get people who speak the language in the positions.
Christine, I want to say I'm glad we had a chance to discuss this subject, and I hope things, obviously, that your work does make a difference as well. Manal, thank you also for joining us and joining this debate.
Thank you.
Thank you so much for having me.
Pleasure. Thanks for being with us. Remember, you can follow the show on Facebook and see what we're up with on shows coming up. This week, you'll find an explanation of our viewing times around the globe and how you can watch in the region. Send us your questions and comments. And on the next show, Russell Means, Native American actor and activist, talks about the legacy of dispossession, not only in America, but around the world. From me and the rest of the team, we'll see you next time.